My name is James Knable. The topic of my presentation is political institutions and terrorist campaign outcomes. When I started this research project, the research question was, does democracy have an effect on terrorism? And if it does, how do democratic institutions within a government affect that government's ability to cope with terrorist operations within its borders? I think this is an interesting question because it has a lot of policy implications. When governments know how their political structure is going to affect their ability to deal with a terrorist campaign, they can use that knowledge to select the most effective strategies for dealing with that campaign. A lot of policymakers have made statements, sometimes pretty strong statements, about the connection between democracy and terrorism. George Bush, most notably, I think, said that democracy and terrorism in Iraq are pretty much mutually exclusive. People have gone on to criticize him on that point, but even Barack Obama has kind of supported parts of that hypothesis by saying that elements of democracy, free speech, participatory government, things like that, ultimately lead to more stable and secure regimes. So I thought this was an interesting topic to take on, to see if these conjectures are true. So this is kind of a mathematical representation of my model, but I'd like to talk first about how I came to construct the model. Previous studies that have looked at the relationship between democracy and terrorism have speculated either that there's a positive or a negative correlation. Those that believe there's a positive correlation between democracy and terrorism, so that means that democracy actually leads to more occurrence of terrorism, they believe that civil liberties in democratic regimes actually allow terrorists to operate more freely within the borders of that government, and so they can actually perpetrate more terrorist activity. The flip side of that is that democracies experience less terrorism because their institutions allow more political participation from opposition groups. And then those opposition groups, those relatively radical groups, don't feel as much of a need to undertake violent activity to accomplish their political goals. Most of these previous studies have taken democracy, measured democracy as a whole, and what I've done is I've divided that independent variable democracy into two different component variables. One is executive constraints, and that just means the restrictions on the executive branch of government when it's enacting any kind of policy, including counterterrorism policy. And the other one is participatory competition, which means the openness of the political system to a range of political viewpoints. So that's the first innovation that my model does. It splits up the independent variable because democracy itself has counteracting effects, and we want to be able to see what each of the effects is and see what the net effect is of democracy. The third innovation that I made is instead of analyzing, most of these studies have analyzed the number of deaths or the number of attacks that terrorists have committed within the country. What my study measures is the probability of a certain outcome in that terrorist campaign. And so the two outcomes that I decided to focus on are suppression and negotiation. Negotiation being some kind of a political settlement where the terrorist group decides not to operate anymore and take part in the legitimate political system. And the other one is suppression, which means the terrorist group is defeated by government, police, or military forces. And I think this is a more accurate model of how terrorist campaigns play out because it allows us not only to separate the counteracting effects of democracy, but also it's helpful to policymakers because they can, instead of seeing that they're going to decrease or increase the number of attacks, they can see exactly where that terrorist group is going to go. So maybe they're going to end the negotiation, but what if the terrorist group succeeded? The number of deaths might decline, but the terrorist group could still have succeeded in overthrowing the regime and taking power, and that could still be a negative outcome, although the number of deaths declining makes it appear to be a positive outcome. So I think this model is more accurate than previous models, and I will now go on to explain exactly the details of it. So here I hypothesize that the probability of negotiation is a positive function of participatory competition. So as the openness of competition within a regime increases, the probability that the terrorist group will negotiate with the government also increases. I hypothesize a negative correlation with executive constraints. So the higher the level of constraints on the executive branch of government, the less likely it is that the government will be able to reach a negotiation outcome, because the government can't operate as freely in negotiating that outcome. And the third variable in there, or the first one actually, is called within system. It measures the stated ideology or goals of the terrorist group. And basically, if the terrorist group has goals that can be accomplished within the existing order, it's more likely that that group would be willing to negotiate. And if they have goals that include regime change or regime overthrow, then I would categorize them as anti-system, and it would be very unlikely that they would negotiate. For suppression, or defeating the terrorist group by military or police defeat, the only variable that I'm actually examining, the only variable of interest, is executive constraints, and I hypothesize that the more the executive constraints, the lower the probability of suppression. So the more freely the executive branch can operate, the more likely it is to bring about a military or police defeat. Some of the results of so I took this model and I applied it to an empirical analysis of all terrorist groups that have existed between 1968 and 2006. Each group is categorized based on the outcome and based on a number of political factors of the government that it's targeting. So what I've found, this graph shows that as the level of participatory competition in the government increases, the probability of a negotiated settlement rises. And you can see that the probability for any given year, this is in a given year of the terrorist group's existence, the probability is fairly low. It only reaches 15% at the highest level of participatory competition. But it's still very telling. There's an obvious correlation. The dotted lines represent the 95% confidence interval to show that it's a statistically significant finding. And this just shows that as the more open the government is, the more likely it is that the terrorist group will choose to end its activities in order to participate in a legitimate political system. As far as a suppression outcome, it shows a clear negative correlation with executive constraints. You can see here that as executive constraints increases, so as the executive branch of government becomes more constrained by civil liberties legislation or by other groups within the government, other branches of government, the probability of a suppression outcome decreases, because the government isn't able to, for instance, the Patriot Act. Without the Patriot Act allows the government to gather more intelligence on its citizens, and without that liberty that the government enjoys, it wouldn't be able to conduct such successful counterterrorism activities. So some conclusions that have resulted from my study. The first one is that when we're looking at the relationship between democracy and terrorism, it's important to consider not only the number of casualties or the number of attacks. It's more important to examine what the ultimate outcome is of the terrorist campaign, so that we can assess the relative success of the counterterrorism operations, and also so that we can assess the ultimate impact that a terrorist campaign had on society. The other two conclusions, one is that through my study we can see that negotiation is mostly a function of the preferences of the individual actors involved in the terrorist campaign. So it has a lot to do with where the preferences of the terrorist group lie, where the preferences of the government lie, how willing they are to cooperate with one another and to include each other's viewpoints. Suppression, on the other hand, doesn't have as much to do with those types of variables. It has more to do with the ability of the government to conduct counterterrorism operations. And one of the variables that I didn't talk about in my results was GDP. I also found that the higher the GDP of a country, the more likely it is to force a military